The main argument of the book, the starting point, is the fact that we are maybe 6 years on from the crisis, a little bit more, beginning with the credit crunch. We are more than 3 years into a conservative-led government implementing austerity, and the left is nowhere. And this is the problem that we're faced. The forces that should be able to put up some sort of resistance to the austerity project, which is one of the most extreme that's ever been visited upon the United Kingdom, is nowhere to be seen. And therefore the question is why? Why should it be? And I argue in part that there's a misunderstanding of what austerity is, and in part that there's a misunderstanding of what has happened to us, to British society at large, but also to the left in general, as a result of neoliberalism. I think austerity is a project for, first of all, meeting a crisis. I mean, this is what happens. There is a crisis of capitalism, and it's a multi-leveled crisis, not simply a recession, but rather a much more deep, fundamental crisis, what Gramsci termed an organic crisis, which afflicts the state, which afflicts the dominant institutions, and which creates a level of turmoil that is potentially threatening to the traditional ruling class, as Gramsci called them. Now, the traditional ruling class has all the advantages in this terrain, in as much as it has the armies of acolytes at its disposal, it has the media, it has think tanks, it has the economic and political concentrated power, it has the support of the dominant forces in the state apparatuses, it has the big banks, so they have tremendous advantages in terms of being able to mobilize. And one of the things that they did very early on, when Labour was still in office and was still implementing kind of a stimulus program, was they said, let's shift the emphasis of the analysis. Let's say that the problem is not a recession, it's not a crisis of capitalism, it's a crisis of state overspending. So I think that's a crisis response. But secondarily, there's it has to be a crisis response. It doesn't just deflect the left's attack. It has to, on the one hand, meet the interests of the traditional ruling class, the capitalist class. It also has to, it's not just about transferring wealth to them, it has to restart the system. It has to get the system up and running, it has to make it profitable. So it's also about finding a growth pattern that works for them. And a growth pattern doesn't necessarily have to be one that is the most dynamic in terms of GDP growth, provided there's sufficient levels of profitability. I don't think we're just going to turn around austerity just like that. I think we can see off the worst of it, but I think we have to recognise it's a long game. We have to have the same sort of long-term vision that the ruling class does. They fought a battle over decades to get to where they are now, with considerable concentrated power. We have to be prepared to fight a similar long-term battle, and that means two things. One, I mean, of course, we try to do what is pragmatically best in the medium term to ward off the worst of the attacks that are coming in terms of cuts to welfare, cuts to the public sector, privatization, all the rest of it. But also, on this, that's directly related to that, we have to try to resist the tendency towards greater authoritarianism on the part of the state and the deployment of racist ideologies to help justify that authoritarianism. In the long term, we need a process of reconstruction. I mean, I often talk about, in connection with this book and with the arguments in it, I talk about the 3 R's. The 3 R's are rethinking, realignment and reconstruction. Rethinking is obvious. We've got a lot of stuff wrong. We haven't really got to grips with the reality that we're in. Realignment is, if the current organisation of the left was adequate, we wouldn't be in the position we're in. So we need to start thinking about not just new parties, new organisations. I think that's all very important, but actually we need to find a way of getting people to work together and create a habitable left-wing ecology, where people aren't constantly being excommunicated for having disagreements and so on and so forth. And of course where people feel more at liberty to think outside of the conventional and established dogmas which don't work. And finally, reconstruction. Well, you know, the fact of the matter is, I've talked about the etiolated state of the British left and, you know, the labour movement and so on. You can go through the statistics: the lowest strike rates in years, the lowest number of days lost to strike action, hardly a rank and file in existence. You know, we used to talk about the rank and file of the labour movement, you know, who would call wildcat action, you know, back in the 1970s just at the drop of a hat. We don't have that anymore. We don't have an infrastructure. There's hardly a labour left in existence anymore. This was the bedrock that could have resisted the tidal wave of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has been restructuring day-to-day life in a very profound way, in a cellular way. We need to reconstruct the kind of cooperative, grassroots, democratic infrastructures that can create cultures of solidarity where people spontaneously stick together, and where if, for example, I'll just give you an example just at random, if someone's going to be kicked out of their house because of the bedroom tax, because they're unable to pay the bedroom tax, that there's a community response to defend them. If you're in a call centre and everybody's on low income, you know how it is, you're on part-time temporary contracts, anybody can lose their job very quickly, and the money's not very good. It's very hard to unionize in those circumstances because of the high turnover of staff, but finding ways to get people like that involved in trade unions, even if you can't get into their workplace to start off with, you could get into their communities, you know. There's a whole series of ways in which we can start to rebuild infrastructures, and we should do this as part of the same social movements that we need to build in order to combat austerity.